From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. On past episodes, you've heard about some of the factors that are impacting honeybee colonies, such as mite parasites and pesticides and lack of forage. But one aspect that is often overlooked is the quality of the queen. Honeybee queens really determine the genetics of the colony, its behavior, and if they're not bred well, it can really impact the colony negatively. And that's why I am so thrilled to have Dr. Shelley Hoover, my former postdoc supervisor and good friend. Dr. Hoover is the Apiculture Unit Lead for the Alberta Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in Lethbridge, Alberta, which is just north of the Montana border. She's also the current president of the Canadian Association of Professional Apiculturists. And the thing about Dr. Hoover's work is it's really practical. So in this episode, you're going to hear about the actual variation that you see in commercial queen stocks, the causes for that variation, and an innovative strategy Dr. Hoover is developing in partnership with Southern Alberta beekeepers to create their own queens during pollination. I just love talking to Shelley any chance I get. I know you're going to love this episode. So without further ado, Dr. Shelley Hoover on pollination. Okay, I am very excited to be in California with a fellow Albertan and very good friend, Dr. Shelley Hoover. Welcome to Pollination.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
It's a lot warmer than Alberta.
Oh God, I'm dying.
So you were at the International Pollinator Conference and you gave a paper, a presentation, talking about queens and Alberta beekeeping. Can you tell us a little bit, just to set this up? Alberta is not a place where, traditionally people buy queens, don't they? It's a place where queens are produced elsewhere, not produced in Canada.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, to a large extent. We do have a number of queen breeders that are very skilled and do breed their own queens, primarily for their own use, although there is a small amount of sales of Alberta queens. But by and large, most Alberta operations, especially the large ones, import their queens. And primarily that's because we can't breed queens early in the year when we need to be requeening. If we don't have spring until March or April, and that's when beekeepers want to be requeening their colonies, but they can't breed queens until, June or July. So for that reason, they import large numbers from California, Hawaii, New Zealand, Australia, Chile, those places.
Where it's either they're just ending their summer, or they're just starting, or
it's
spring's
either
earlier.
contra season or it's an aseasonal environment, which is much more tropical than where we live.
Okay, so just for people who aren't beekeepers who are listening, like why are these early queens so important? You were talking about requeening. Why can't you do that any time of the year? And tell us a little bit about that.
So it's, in terms of colony health and productivity, it's very important to have a good productive queen, and younger queens tend to be more productive. But also when beekeepers are checking their colonies in the spring after overwintering, whether that's indoors and outdoors, there's always a subset that have lost their queen. So you need queens either to replace the queens in those colonies that don't have one, or to replace queens that are failing. And then beekeepers also like to just replace queens to keep a young, vigorous queen in there.
Mm-hmm. I guess the other thing is making splits and stuff like that. There's a kind of seasonality to dividing the colonies and things like that. You don't want them to swarm, I suppose.
Right, exactly. For swarm, whether you're making splits or colony divisions, either for swarm management or to increase the number of colonies you have, if you make a split, you're going to need a second queen to put into that split.
Okay. All right. So these queens are coming from all over the world, because there's Alberta's a big place for beekeeping. There's like 200,000 colonies in the province.
312,000.
100,000 more. There's like 30%.
It's been a while since you lived there.
Yeah, man, what's going on up there? Okay, no, that's right. Okay, so there's 300,000 colonies, a lot of queens that are needed. And they're coming from different sources and suppliers. I imagine one of the things that comes up is where to get the queens from. I always hear this from people. It's like they say, "Oh, I got them from this person." Tell us a little bit about that issue.
Yeah, so there's a few issues surrounding that. One is, where is supply available? Because, things happen in bad weather, or, things happen with businesses, things happen with borders can be closed. Because we are importing, we have to deal with international import regulations.
Yeah.
And then there's also, which suppliers have beekeepers had good experience with. Which ones are they able to get queens with? So all of those things impact beekeepers' decisions on where they're going to get queens, as well as, of course, cost.
So and given that there's different sources and different kind of restrictions, quality, I imagine, is one in addition to cost. The quality of the queens. What determines the quality of a queen?
There's a number of different things that can go into determining queen quality, and actually we just did a project looking at whether in these queen shipments that are being imported, whether there's measures we can look at on these shipments that are going to be predictive of their performance if we put these queens in a colony. And of course, when you're talking about quality control in queens, you're talking most often about destructive sampling. So you have to, you can evaluate a subset of the queens that would be going into those colonies, but you can't actually evaluate the queen that is in that specific colony because you're destructively sampling her. So we tend to measure things like the size of the queen, the weight of the queen, how much sperm is in her spermatheca, which is the sperm storage organ in a queen, as well as the viability of that sperm.
Oh, okay, spermatheca.
Right.
That's
so
a
the
funny word.
spermatheca
What is that?
is the organ. It's like a little tiny ball, and if the queen has no sperm, it'll be crystal clear.
Really?
And little known fact, bee sperm is actually pink. So if
Pink?
you dissect out,
Aw, that's so cute.
if you dissect out a spermatheca and it's cloudy with this kind of iridescent pink color, then that's the sign of a well-mated queen. And you can take the sperm out of that spermatheca if you dissect it and look at it under a microscope and tell whether or not the sperm in her spermatheca is viable or not.
Oh, I see. It could be that it's full, but it's
But
very
the
low
sperm
viability.
are all dead, exactly.
Okay, so you did this experiment or this kind of survey where you brought the queens that were coming in from these various sources into the Alberta market, and you destructively sampled some of them, you weighed them and looked at them, and you got looked at the sperm viability. Was there any difference in quality?
Right. So we collaborated with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the National Bee Diagnostics Centre for this experiment. And so they did all the queen analysis. And then we put some of the stock in our colonies and some of the stocks in the colonies at Agriculture Canada in Beaver Lodge. And we compared their performance in these two different sites. And then the National Bee Diagnostic Centre did the diagnostics on the queens. And so we measured up for these stocks that we were importing. And two were international stocks. And one was a Canadian stock from British Columbia.
Okay.
And we evaluated, a number of these physical characteristics of the queen, but also the viability of the sperm and the number of sperm in these queens that we were importing. And what we found was on average, all of the stocks were fairly well mated, but there were differences where some stocks had more viable sperm than others. And more importantly, I think some stocks had a greater proportion of queens, which even, irrespective of the average sperm count of these stocks, there were some that were just not viable.
Oh, that's disturbing. So the queens come in, they need all this, because I guess unlike a cow or something where you just need a couple good sperms to make a calf, here you need to make a lot of little workers, and so if half of them are not viable, then that must really have an impact on the colony. Is that did you notice that? So you said you took some of the same queens from the same batch and actually put them in colonies. Did this translate into what would that even manifest like? What would happen what would it look like if?
Well, I think one point that's important with your cow analogy is if you have a cow, she can go out and mate again, whereas a queen honeybee doesn't go out and mate again. So all the sperm she has for her life is stored in that spermatheca when she's taken her, couple of mating flights when she's young. So the sperm she has is the sperm she gets, and if something happens to it, it's damaged, then she doesn't get any more.
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, great.
And so what we saw in these colonies that we put these subset of the queens in was that actually the performance of the colonies wasn't linked to sperm viability like we thought it would be. What we found instead was that brood pathogens were actually what was limiting the population growth in these colonies.
Okay, so the bees, the diseases the bees got, what does that have to do with the queen?
So one of the things that queen does in addition to just producing eggs is passing on her genetics through these eggs into the worker population. And what we think is going on, and we need to collect more evidence for this, but what we think is going on is that that particular stock that we saw, even though it had high viability, it had very patchy brood patterns, and we think that there's some kind of either an inherent sort of physiological susceptibility to certain brood diseases, or it's possible that there's also reduced hygienic behavior in that stock.
All right, let me get this straight. So when a queen lays, I know this, I've kept bees before, they lay eggs in a kind of, they don't just scatter eggs around, it's like,
Right, there's a contiguous section of comb that's filled with eggs at the same time.
Before she moves on. So there's
before she moves on.
Same
so
age.
There should be a patch of same-aged worker larvae turning into the same-aged worker pupae.
So when a bee pupates, the honeybees put a little wax capping on top of it. And what you're saying is one way to measure her quality is you look at how many of those caps might be missing.
Right. Is it a continuous, lovely selection of capped brood, or are there spots missing? And they could be empty, they could be filled with honey, they could be pollen, but that something has happened to that egg that queen has laid.
And
it might have died as a larva, it might have died as a pupa, we don't know, but it's gone.
So it could be, just to string the logic around it could be an egg that's unfertilized, and that's a problem, and so it dies. The other possibility is that it's a larva. She's got high viability. It's a fertilized larva, and it turns into. But somewhere along her development, she catches the disease and dies, and it leads to patchiness. And what you're saying is what really seemed to be the predominant, really kind of main factor in that patchiness was you had queens that had really good viability, but those larvae were just not adapted to that disease.
Right. So the queen was laying unfertilized, or the queen was laying fertilized eggs, because unfertilized eggs develop into drones. So the two possibilities really are that it could be a diploid drone if she's mated to drones that have the same sex alleles as her. Maybe she's from an inbred population or something. Or and that can be called shotgun brood. But the other time we see that kind of a brood pattern where it's really spotty and patchy is when there's brood diseases present.
Okay. So we've got this varying quality and queens coming into the province. Let's take a break, and I want to come back to you and ask you about some of the ways to get around this problem through making your own queens.
Sounds good.
All right. And we're back. That was a very short interlude, because I think I knew exactly what I want to ask you next. The next question I want to ask you is, so if bringing queens in has these kind of limitations, there can be sperm can be inviable for whatever reason, or they're not adapted. How can you get around this problem? If the market won't supply what you need, then what else can you do?
Well, I think I want to before we go there, I want to take one step back, and that's sort of just talk about the issues that we can see that can contribute to that sperm viability loss in these stocks we're bringing in.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And recent research has shown that shipping is a really dangerous point in time for a queen's life, especially if they're being shipped from, the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. There's a lot of opportunity during that transit for them to get too hot or too cold or not fed well, and so that's a very dangerous time for a queen. And so that's when we can see, with temperature extremes, for example, that we'll have reduced sperm viability in these queens. That's one way it can happen.
Oh, so the queens that are being shipped, there must be a optimal. Well, I think we saw a paper earlier. There's some optimal temperatures. Alison McAfee had a really nice talk about this. But if for some reason during shipment, we had Danielle Downey talk about this Project APSM, how they, were educating the post office people when the shipments come in to make sure it wasn't too hot or too cold. But it comes from Chile or Australia or New Zealand, mm-hmm. and hits a little bit of hot temperature, and even though the queen breeder did everything right, the queen producer.
Right, exactly. It could be, and people are quick to blame queen producers, but often it's not their fault at all. It's something that's happened during shipment. They can do everything right, and you can still end up receiving a queen that's maybe not as ideal as you would like.
Okay, that was a good backup step. So just to clarify this with some of these inviability issues, likely post production kind of issues.
Right, but I mean, there's other things that can contribute. You could have drones that were perhaps exposed to pesticide and they were still able to mate, but maybe their sperm is not viable.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we've got the so we've got this, and we've got the problem of lack of adaptation. So what are we just stuck?
Right, so that brings us to rearing your own queens, which is what we're advocating now for beekeepers, and I think this is nothing new. This idea has been around a lot, and there are Alberta beekeepers who do this very well already. But what we're trying to do is work it into our canola pollination system. So we have a lot of beekeepers that pollinate hybrid canola seed production. And what we have as a result is this time period where we have really high densities of really good strong double colonies with lots of brood and no queen excluders, so the drones aren't trapped, they can get out. And so we have really high density of these at a time when we have really good mating weather. So it's warm, it's not too windy, which can be a problem in our area. And so it's really an ideal situation for mating queens. And so what we found is that the queens that we've mated ourselves under these conditions are in fact really good. They have high sperm viability. We get really good overwintering success when we make our splits with these queens. And what I like about this management style is that these queens are never, because we're making splits and introducing a queen cell to that split, these queens are never caged.
Oh, they're never shipped.
They're never banked. They're just kept with their workers that have been taking care of them, those nurse bees, their whole life. So you don't lose any queens at introduction.
Yeah.
You don't, have their tarsal pads chewed when they're in the queen bank. So all of these things that are a problem with queens are suddenly not an issue.
Because the queen the queen cell in this situation, you make your own queens, and we had this episode with Heather Higo, who are both has mentored both of us.
Yeah, she's the godmother of queen rearing.
So Heather has this great episode back. You can hear about the queen rearing, but you end up with this waxy queen cell, and you're saying what happens, the person, when beekeepers are in pollination, they can take some of the excess brood and bees off their colonies. Well, I guess they have to move it to another location, but they've got probably a bunch of different locations.
We've had beekeepers do it both ways. We've had
Really?
beekeepers just make splits and then move them into these pollination fields, and we've had beekeepers just literally pull a frame out of colonies that were big and in pollination and stick them in that same field.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So and for those of you, for listeners who are not beekeepers, we're going to go deep and hard here now. It's going to be a little confusing for you. But so because the issue is if you take, you can actually divide colonies by taking bees and brood out of it and adding either a mated queen or a queen cell. But sometimes the bees will fly back to their house. But there must be something about just the intensity of that pollination. So many bees. And so much young brood that
Right, and I should clarify a little bit. So the frames that the beekeepers are taking out, if they're not moving them when they make the split, are frames of nurse bees, right? So they're not foragers, so they haven't yet taken orientation flights and oriented to that particular colony. So when we take them out, their age-related task will sort of advance because we've removed the foragers from their colony, their new colony. We've actually taken them out and made them form a new colony. So those older nurse bees will start to forage, and then they'll orient to the new position that they're in, rather than, reorienting and going home to their previous home.
Okay, so that's not a lot of work. You're in your bee yard. You've started pollination. The colonies are nice and strong. You've put all the bees out, which is an exhausting time. You got to get all these bees into all these
Right. So
yards.
Hopefully you've got a couple days sleep, and then you're raring to go.
So you got a couple days sleep, and then I guess somebody's been rearing the queens somewhere in the operation for you, and then you go through those colonies and you find the ones that are really strong, and the grower's not losing anything because you're
not removing any bees.
You're not moving any bees from the field. You're just taking some of the brood, you're putting it into another colony, another box, and you're putting a queen cell there, and then the queen emerges, and then she flies up into an area that's just saturated because there's so many bee colonies. This must be the highest amount of drones in the
Right,
world.
Exactly. Yeah, really high density of drones, and I think that's good because it's going to encourage competition for mating. The other way that we've worked with beekeepers in doing this is we make queen cells, and they'll just simply take the queen cell and put it in a honey super and let that queen emerge, and then the hope is that she'll take over that colony naturally, and the old queen will be the one that they knock off.
So wait a second. So here it is. You've got this big colony. You rear the queen cell. The queen goes into like the top super, very far from where the resident queen is.
Right, and so hopefully she'll emerge into bees that have sort of accepted her because they're very far away physically from the other queen.
Okay, and so she kind of like then starts nosing around, I guess, finds that queen.
Well, she'll probably mate first.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then come back and, they'll sort it out. But what we don't know at this point is how often does the first queen win versus how often does this new young queen win.
So I guess you're accomplishing this thing that we started the episode with. You want to requeen a colony, and here you've done it without $40 or so for a queen.
Right, which is the cost of an imported queen.
You've produced these queens, which are not that difficult. You listen to the episode with Heather Higo, and you'll see how to get at least the gist of it. And then you put it in there, and then they requeen just before winter, I guess. They're late summer. They're going to requeen, and that queen's going to lay some eggs, and then you've accomplished the same thing at very less effort.
Right. So I think that is critical. That what you're accomplishing is that they're going into winter with a young, vigorous, strong laying queen, and I think that's going to really help with overwintering success. And there are some, there is a few costs to this. It's not free. You have to have labor, and you have to devote labor at a time when beekeepers are already busy. And most importantly, I think, is just the organization it takes in queen rearing is sort of foreign to some beekeepers who aren't used to it, because you have to really be strict. If you're late by a day and all your queens emerge, it's chaos and you've lost everything. So you really have to be on top of it and do it according to the schedule.
I guess there's the one thing I remember you saying. You sort of looked at the costs of producing the queens, and it maybe it turns out to be $1 versus $40
for a queen cell.
For a queen cell.
Yeah, I mean we're working with Miriam Bixby, who's an economist at University of British Columbia, on the costs of importing queens, which we know, versus the cost of getting our own mated queens, versus the cost of a queen cell, and the queen cells come out very, very cheap. So even if you have to try again in terms of putting another queen cell in, I think it's well worth it.
I guess the other part of it as well is, as you say, a lot of very talented beekeepers don't know how to rear queens. It's just not, it hasn't been that important for their businesses. And I do recall the example in northern Alberta with Fairview College that it really does take a concerted training program to kind of get people to learn those skills.
Right, it does. But if you look at some of the beekeepers that came out of that training program, they're very skilled, and they continue to rear their own queens, and they're operations that have, reliably had fairly good winter losses, and they're still in business, and they're very skilled beekeepers.
Fantastic. Well, let's take one more break, and I got these questions to ask you. Ask all my guests these questions. Curious what your answers are going to be.
Oh, I have another tool I thought of.
Oh,
like 3 tools.
Oh my God. Okay, all right. Get ready for this,
or
guest.
4.
The 4-tool episode of pollination. Okay. Okay, and we're back. Okay, so Dr. Hoover, tell us about a book recommendation you have.
A book recommendation. I'm going to recommend the Kappa Disease and Pest Manual. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with it. But
Dr. Not Dr. Higo. She should be Dr. Higo.
She should be.
So Heather was the last person to recommend that publication, but tell us a little bit about it.
So this publication, it is written from a Canadian perspective, and it's published by the Canadian Association of Professional Apiculturists. But it outlines all the major bee pathogens and talks a bit about their biology, and it has pictures of them. And I think most importantly, it's available in English and French and now Spanish edition as well.
Oh, yeah, that's a new Spanish edition
There's a new Spanish edition, and this publication is only $10, so I really recommend it to beekeepers because they can have a few, they can put it in their truck, and you can give it to your employees to read at the lunch table. So it's a great sort of primer on bee diseases.
And I did the European foul brood section, and so I can attest that each of these sections were written. They're not like regurgitated materials. Like a subject area expert was recruited to write them, so they're like very rich and very kind of contemporary accounts of these diseases and pests.
Right, exactly. So the editor, Stephen Purnell and Heather Clay, they really went to, like you say, subject matter experts for each of the sections on each of the diseases and pathogens.
Fantastic recommendation. Pick that up if you and I also I think you and I have had a bunch of conversations over the past week about elevation of brood diseases, which we've not been there in the past. So this is a great way to get yourself prepared for some of these diseases.
Right, and just familiarize yourself with them so you know the way if you see them, you know what you're seeing.
Okay, so the next question I have is, and before the break, you started proliferating tools. Tell us about some of your tools.
Right, so I have a lot of favorite tools, mostly because my technician, Lene, is so great at coming up with these really innovative and functional ideas of how we can improve what we do. So we have a lot of little tips and tricks that we like to use. So I have a few favorite tools. I think one of my favorites this year has been a queen wheel. So you're probably familiar with queen wheels.
Oh, yeah,
but
sure.
I don't know if your audience is.
No.
It's I have kids, and so when you have kids, when you're first pregnant, you go to the doctor and they say, when was your last period? And they have this little wheel that they then figure out your due date. And this is what it's like for queen rearing. So you look at, the egg was laid this day, and then you spin the wheel so that day lines up with what day of the month the queen actually laid the eggs, and it'll tell you what day you can graft and what day you need to move those queen cells, what day the queen should be mated. And there's all kinds of useful information on there. And you just, simply spin the wheel to figure out what day you need to do everything for queen rearing. So that's one of my favorites.
Well, especially as we've talked about queen rearing, oftentimes you have to fit it in between things. And you're at very busy times. So if you have a queen wheel, you could say,
this is when I can't do anything.
Or this Friday I have some time, and this means that next Monday, week Monday, I'm going to have to be out there.
Exactly. It allows you to fit it in where you need it to.
Fantastic. Okay, so what else? What else do you and Lene got?
You and I were just talking about the calf sled, which was one of Lene's ideas. So we have a calf sled, which are used by farmers to literally pull baby cows around. But we use it all kinds of ways in our operation. So we use it when we have to weigh colonies. We'll put the scale on the calf sled, and then we'll get it all balanced so that it's level. And then we can just slide that around the yard instead of having to pick it up and carry it and re-level it every time. We also use it to if we pick up a colony and put it on it and we want to carry it, to the other end of the yard or something. Not that I recommend beekeepers do this, but we do weird stuff in research all the time. So you can just slide the colony around. Another tool I have that I like is a hive lifter, which is it's sort of a ovular shaped metal tube that you slide over the top of a colony, and then it bends in the middle, and so you can, with two people, they can lift as many boxes as they want. It sort of sticks in the handles.
It gets in the handles, and so it's and then it kind of you fold it over, you kind of open it up, and it goes over the colony easily and fits there, and then it kind of
it jams against it. It jams in there, and you can carry the colonies this way.
I've carried one or two colonies with Lene, although she may say it was only one or two colonies.
Or she may say she carried them herself. You didn't really help.
It may be true.
The other tool I have that I used this year a lot for the first time is, I don't know if you've ever seen Paul Kelly's bee belts.
Oh, all the people, if you're in Oregon, you'll see that all the OSU apiculture staff have these really beautifully built bee belts. Tell us a little bit about them.
Right, so they're leather belts, and they come in different sizes and different orientations. You can get a left-handed bee belt or a right-handed bee belt, and what it has a little pouch where you can put any tools you want. There's a spot for a queen cage, a spot for markers, a spot for scissors, and then there's a really powerful magnet for those people who lose their hive tools a lot. So you can just magnet your hive tool and just slap it on your belt. Yeah. And then I usually stick through the belt, I'll put masking tape or whatever I happen to be using at that time. And it's really good when you're going through and you're checking all of your splits for queens, because you can just, you can mark her, you can cage her, you can do whatever you want. It's all just on your belt, and you don't have to pick up a bunch of stuff and move it from pallet to pallet because it's all attached to you.
It's worth noting Paul Kelly is brilliant. I think there's a number of tools in your lab and in the Sagili lab that have been built by Paul. He's a real craftsperson.
He is, absolutely. We've got a frame holder that tilts it. You can put a frame on it and it'll hold it for grafting, and you can move it back and forth so it's just the right angle to see in and see the brood that Paul Kelly made us. And we've also got a observation hive that he made that's just beautiful.
And, the one thing it just reminds me of, for those of you who haven't seen it, the University of Guelph has this wonderful YouTube page that Paul, who's done years of beekeeping education, but if you're looking for, and it's covers things like queen rearing really well, actually. So if you want to learn some of these skills, University of Guelph Apiculture YouTube channel is really worth visiting.
Yeah, they're really, really
amazing.
well done.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings us. Oh, and it should be said, people don't figure this out by now. I was your postdoc. I was your postdoc.
Right. Yeah. So
postdoc.
I was your. Well, I would say more of a facilitator for your postdoc than a supervisor, and it's also worth noting that I took over for you when you left your position at Beaver Lodge.
The funny thing is that Shelley and I also we had a episode with Heather Higo, but also Mark Winston. We were both. I keep missing you. You're just one step ahead, because you started. I've just finished in the Winston lab, and then
When
you
I started.
But that lab also
Yeah.
included Danielle Downey, who's a guest. She was in that lab, as was Jeff Pettis.
As was Jeff Pettis,
Yeah.
and Nathan Rice was a technician at the USDA for
yeah.
a while.
It was a great
Rob
lab.
Curry was a postdoc there. Steve Purnell.
Oh, the golden days.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe you just go through that list and you have more people to interview for your podcast.
That's true. Yeah. So it's been great. So oh yes, favorite bee. That was a sidetrack.
My favorite bee.
Yeah.
Yes, my favorite bee is the honeybee, but especially I love queens and drones. I like workers too, but I love working.
Oh,
with
I
queens.
guess one thing to mention is that when you started working on queen questions early on, queen competition, wasn't it?
My PhD was actually on worker reproduction.
Ah, that's right.
Yeah.
Oh, workers that aspired to be queens.
Right. I could sympathize with them, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's long overdue. I'm really glad to have had you as a guest, and good luck with helping Alberta beekeepers get better quality queens in their colonies.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening. Show notes with information discussed in each episode can be found at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. We'd also love to hear from you, and there are several ways to connect. For one, you can visit our website to post an episode-specific comment, suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at pollinationpodcast@oregonstate.edu. Finally, you can tweet questions or comments or join our Facebook or Instagram communities. Just look us up at OSU Pollinator Health. If you like the show, consider letting iTunes know by leaving us a review or rating. It makes us more visible, which helps others discover pollination. See you next week.